It's a very bad idea to cancel Russian culture. Let's talk about why. Grant on Patreon, hi Grant, sent in a question about this. And we're going to have a go at answering it because I think a lot of people have been wondering how to balance this business of being against Russia's politics, but not being against Russia's cultural contribution, Russian art, Russian music, Russian literature, and so on. Have a listen to these few seconds of a recording from the 1940s of Beethoven's Fifth Piano Concerto with Walter Gieseking at the keyboard. Listen for the artillery fire in the background. I don't think this is a weird constellation, humans making music, humans firing. But here is an attempt by a very famous late intellectual, George Steiner, to make this seem weird, to make a paradox out of this. Have a listen to George.
And we have recordings where you hear the gunfire of the Russian artillery approaching Berlin. And Furtwängler's Beethoven and one Haydn recording at that time played in the dark, the people in the audience knowing they were doomed into a horrible fate. And there are no greater recordings or readings of that music known to me than those. For many, many years, I was trying to understand why music does not say no at certain occasions. Dachau, as you know, is just outside Munich, just outside. And the trains with the people in them dying of thirst and hunger on the way to Dachau used to pass not far at all from the great music hall. In that hall, Gieseking was giving his Debussy cycle, and good judges say that there's never been a greater interpretation of Debussy. And my question was to German students, and I began asking it immediately after the war, to German school children, why did the music not say no?
Throughout his career, George would often be criticized for pursuing smartness and erudition as an end in itself. And I do think that that was sometimes a fair criticism of him. And I think that what we've just seen is a perfect example of this. Seeking depth, there is plenty of depth in the world, in a place where there actually isn't depth, trying to make a paradox out of something that isn't paradoxical. And, you know, I work with artists who are sort of aged 30 to 50, typically, professional artists. And one of the things you come across over and over and over is that an artist confuses the idea of something with the thing itself. The artist confuses depth with the idea of depth. And then you need to break down that misapprehension and the way it's practically expressed via the medium of their art form. And then begin sort of organically, which is a very individual process, developing a way of actually breaking through to the depth itself rather than simply the idea of it. And I think here, George is giving us the idea of a deep thing, but with no deep thing to be seen. And that's really because I think that aesthetic value and ethical value point in different directions. There's no paradox in Gesualdo, who is a composer who has come to the fore in recent decades. He worked in the 1500s, early 1600s, and wrote extraordinary madrigals that really revolutionized chromatic expression in music in a way we hadn't seen up until things that happened in the 19th century. And he was at the same time a brutal murderer who loved making music and loved killing people. It's a very difficult thing that you always keep getting pulled into, because it's such a thing in our culture to want to say, well, aesthetic value and ethical value go together, but they really don't. And there is something else here that's also really important that I want you to consider breaking as a connection. So if we break the connection between aesthetic value and ethical value, there's also a connection that really ought to be broken between the biography of an artist and their professional output. You know, if you take, let's say, Beethoven, certainly wasn't evil, but he was complex. He confiscated the child of his brother's wife when his brother died, was abusive to that child. That child tried to kill themselves. Beethoven's personal life was in complete disarray. If you met Beethoven, you would realize that, yes, here is a man capable of feeling, if not quite translating into social interaction, the most extraordinary kind of tenderness and the most extraordinary kind of ironic and critical love of human beings and the world as it is, and a very tender love at that, a tender love of all that's flawed about humans. So he had these extraordinary qualities, but at the same time, if you met him, you'd feel uncomfortable. It would be dangerous. He would be an edgy personality. You would be there and you wouldn't know whether he'd still be standing in front of you 30 seconds later, whether he'd be ripping down your wallpaper. And it's Beethoven and you don't know what to do. So there is this gap between the biography and the artistic output. It's the biography of a, not just a potentially flawed, but a delimited personality that then, particularly in the case of Beethoven, can go on a trajectory of expression that feels utterly extraordinary and limitless. So just like breaking that connection between ethics and aesthetics, it's helpful to break that connection between biography and art production. And now here is something else that's really important. I mean, we're talking about music, we can talk about painting, we can talk about literature. Well, let's think about, Russian literature, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. What are they doing? What is their right in doing? Well, one of the things that is a very general thing to say about them, but it's not a completely vacuous thing to say, is that they're contributing to European literature. And that's even more glaringly obvious in the case of musical output, whether we rate particular composers or not. But what are Shostakovich and Stravinsky doing? They are taking musical language that Beethoven and Schubert inherited from Mozart and Haydn and passed on to Schumann, Chopin, Liszt, Brahms, Mahler, skipping a lot, musical language that then fell out of the tonal system. It's one and the same musical language that is being developed by these people. They're engaged with a particular musical tradition that is the tradition of Western art music. So the problem with talking about Russian art is that you're really talking about strands of European art. So cancelling that is cancelling ourselves. Cancelling that is cancelling our own efforts to imaginatively engage with being in the world as a civilization. So let's get a little more practical. In the West, we've got a problem with cancel culture. And you might think that we don't really, that that's a made-up story. And the story that it's a made-up story is a delusion. It's a very damaging one. And it's damaging to you in particular if you are under the spell of that delusion because it deactivates you politically. It makes you not a politically efficacious citizen. In other words, you might stand up for the causes that you're very passionate about, the social justice causes that you're very passionate about, for example. But if you do that through the mechanism of hyper-identity politics, which is what cancel culture comes out of, you're in fact going to be at best running on the spot when it comes to dealing with making the world a better place in the way you want. Now, already, Western cancel culture has brought out some farcical stories whereby folks who are anti-Putin have been affected. Take one example. Somebody we've mentioned on our chats is the young Russian sociologist, political philosopher Greg Yudin. And Greg was in hospital at the beginning of the war after he ended up being beaten during a protest, anti-war protest. And he is one of the bravest anti-war voices for the first few weeks of the war based in Russia. And a conference deplatformed him because they didn't want to have a Russian speaker. Obviously, he pointed out how absurd that was. And they said, yeah, we understand, but I just think on balance at the moment we're not really comfortable and because of this and that. And his response to that was, you know what this is? Putinism. This is exactly the kind of psychology that makes people complicit with what's happening in the universities in Russia now, which is that the FSB is inserting itself into university bureaucracies. So it's very important that we take this issue seriously and we don't allow excesses of that kind to occur. And there is no doubt that the trouble with them occurring isn't that we're going to ban a few Russian people. It's, I mean, that too, but it's that for us here ourselves, it's very, very damaging to practice cancel culture. It certainly affected the university system, less in the UK than in the US, but in the UK quite a lot too. Because I'm going to get right into the controversial examples of where it's been a problem, let's take an uncontroversial example, an example that's really not been a hot point, but just to illustrate the structure of the problem and what the correct practice needs to be and what the incorrect practice is. Roger Scruton was a conservative philosopher who died not very long ago. And in the last few I'm deliberately picking somebody who wasn't in any serious way a victim of cancel culture, but I'm just want to illustrate a point by picking a sort of a very, very small example. Roger Scruton had lots of attempts to deplatform him. He ran into in the last few years of his life, in good part for reasons of his silly views about homosexuality. He had conservative and homophobic views. And there are two models here. One is to deplatform him, and the other is to let him speak, but then at the end of his talk, say, Roger, what you said is prejudiced, bigoted, silly, irresponsible. How dare you say this nonsense, you know? And I'm not just telling you off now, I'm hiring this lecture hall for tomorrow, for me, and tomorrow I'll be telling the world why your views about this are so silly and so offensive and inappropriate. And you see, this is what we've got to do. And we've got to do it not because free speech is so important, but because reality is so important. When we begin to narrow the circle of what it is that's permissible for us to say. And of course, some things have got to stay out, like violence and threats of violence and various ways of stoking up an environment where people in a legitimate way feel physically unsafe. But apart from that, a university has basically got to include everything. Otherwise, we're going to bring out generations of people who are simply unable to engage in conflict constructively in society. So this is a bit of a rant, but it's a rant that's really important. We hurt ourselves very much by practicing cancel culture. And if we begin to apply it, particularly indiscriminately, to representatives of Russian academic life or Russian artistic life, we're going to be in real trouble. And so what other practical things obviously seem to follow? Well, I think that one thing that probably is worth saying is that we shouldn't worry about anything like cancel culture in Ukraine, because they're in the middle of a war and they have a damn right to do whatever the hell they please. And eventually they will reintroduce as much of the elements of Russian culture that they want to kick out according to their own judgment at the time that they want to do that. So we can't criticize Ukrainians for doing anything. They can do whatever the hell they like. I mean, there are some things that aren't healthy for them to do. And I think there are certainly risks in Ukraine which are about Ukrainians arguing with each other about who is more anti-Russian, and in the process risking throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because in the end, their problem is that they have been, in a colonial and brutal way, invaded by a culture that's terribly close to them. So that's a difficult one to come out of. But putting that aside, practically, we've got a very simple situation. If you're employed by the Russian regime and you are a painter, conductor, filmmaker, and you've got some kind of official affiliation, yeah, that's a very good reason to put your professional activities in the West into question, or just stop them. The second thing that's clear is that if you have got informal connections with the Putin regime that can be proven, that's also a very good reason for saying, I'm so sorry, but bye-bye. If it's clear that because of your links with the regime, you seem to be doing your work in the music world or in the visual art world, but suddenly you've got 3 apartments in New York, and it's clear where that money has come from, no problem. But what about examples that might sort of strike us as grey? Imagine that Lisa Batiashvili, who is the best living violinist, if Lisa weren't a Georgian who is passionately pro-Ukrainian at the moment and is living in Germany with her family, imagine that Lisa weren't Georgian, that she were Russian, that she were living in Petersburg, that she had no formal links with the regime, didn't even attend a single government function at any point in her career, that she was the leading violinist in the world, and that she had a pro-Russian view on the war, just in her capacity as a private citizen. What should we do with her? My position on this is very, very clear. She plays. And if the Barbican Centre in London or the South Bank banned her, I'd find that outrageous. And at an emotional level, I'd find it viscerally offensive. Offensive against Beethoven, against Brahms, offensive against our tradition of art music in the West. Because we're prioritizing the leading exponent of that tradition on a particular instrument. We're prioritizing over the leading exponent of that tradition on a particular instrument their dumb private views about which we're not interested. So that doesn't mean that I would boycott that concert hall, just like I would boycott a conference where folks are getting cancelled, just because aesthetic values would take priority for me over ethical values. And if some other great performer played in that hall, I would be there, no matter how much I dislike the bureaucracy of that hall. But nevertheless, in this case, where we've got just pro-Russian private views, in my view, the musician absolutely gets to play. I've got a quick announcement. You know how we've got this channel, we've got the main channel. I think both of these channels for me are about starting with you, starting with your curiosities, your concerns, your interests, your anxieties. And then the ideas, the analysis, that comes second, and it's tailored to where you are starting from, where you find yourself. And that's what it means for me to have a healthy public intellectual conversation. And as you and I are doing, little by little, build a community around that. But I'm starting 2 new YouTube channels that I don't want 97% of you to subscribe to, but you're going to see them around, so I want to say a bit about them. The first is already up, and it's Vlad Vexler Music, and that's a place for geeky, niche, classical music discussion that's going to be of relevance to people who are either professionally in that world or just very, 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 very much love classical music. For most people, that channel will not be of value. The same with Vlad Vexler Philosophy coming soon. There, perhaps, I think there could be conversations that are more accessible, but again, probably not to the vast majority of us in this community. It's going to be quite geeky. It's going to be a lot about questions that professional philosophers worry about, and nobody's going to watch these channels. So why am I starting them? I'm starting them because I want to build up little libraries with my ideas on music and philosophy, which are going to be retrospectively of relevance, hopefully a few years from now, when, if things go well, health allowing, I make a contribution to the culture via books. And then this little library of ideas will have some cultural relevance. But until then, these videos will just be hanging around with 77 or 12 or 50 views. You're going to see them, so don't think that I've lost my mind and that I'm doing something that looks unintelligible. This is why I'm doing it. And I'm being very intentional when I say don't subscribe unless you're really into it. Mostly because I want to serve you and be of value to you, but also because the way this silly app works is that if somebody's starting a super geeky channel, then the channel benefits if only super geeky people on that topic sort of sub to it. That's what I wanted to share. Thank you so much for your time. See you very soon for a big video on the main channel, I think on Sunday, and little videos will appear on the Clips channel in the next few days too. Bye, 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 bye.